Let's talk about it all with Congressman Mike Quigley, Democrat from Illinois' 5th District, returns. Thank you before you head back to Washington. Always appreciate your time.
Glad to be here.
Well, let's start with this book. I mean, as of this morning, I didn't have this topic for you.
Yeah.
And so what do you think? You know, people say, well, nobody says Michael Wolff is telling the truth. Maybe things aren't that bad in the White House. What sense do you have? You're there.
Yeah, I think there's chaos in the White House. I think the staff don't have the foggiest notion what the president's going to tweet in the morning. And I think they're afraid of what's going to happen that day. I don't think there's a coherent path and leadership there. And it's pretty scary.
One of the points made in the book is that the president, I think actually it's not a surprise, he didn't expect to win. They actually, for them, Michael Wolff writes, losing was winning for everything that they would sort of get out of that. And then, of course, they found themselves there. But that's part of the explanation for why some of these meetings with Russians, you know, may have taken place. They never expected to win. So they kind of proceeded with that. But that being said, do allegations in a book like that impact the committees, the intel committees and the various committees doing these investigations? Does this impact you?
No, I mean, look, I think maybe if it draws interest into the Russian investigation and people realize it needs to continue, that's helpful. But otherwise, I don't need Bannon or Wolff to tell me what actually took place and what we need to do to go forward. So it's noise in the wilderness at this point.
Now, the news last night was that Fusion GPS had an editorial in today's, I think, New York Times, and they basically said all this stuff about the dossier, which Trump says is false and all of that, but their point was that actually is not what triggered this investigation. But here's what I do want to ask you about. Apparently, the only records that Congress ever asked for were the records of, bank records, I mean, Fusion GPS. They didn't ask for the banking records. The whole point of this report was follow the money. This is about money laundering, Michael Wolff writes, and yet Congress never asked for those records. That would suggest Congress was not really trying to get to the root of this.
Well, let me say this. There are a lot of things that still have to happen in this investigation, and the financial aspect is extraordinarily important. We read recently that Mr. Mueller issued a subpoena for Deutsche Bank. Deutsche Bank was fined something like $610 million for being part of a Russian money laundering scheme that involved $10 billion. So it's evidence there's a lot more that needs to go forward. And the fact is my Republican colleagues aren't moving forward at all toward that end. So it makes it difficult to find out exactly what took place, how to prevent it in the future.
And I want to ask you about that because, you know, essentially, look, people make comparisons to Watergate, but in Watergate, Republicans back then put country before party. And it appears that some of the folks in charge, Devin Nunes, for example, I mean, party seems to be taking, and they're trying to shut this thing down, or so it looks. So it really doesn't matter. The Democrats say we're going to get to the bottom of it. You're not the one, all due respect, calling the shots.
Well, we don't get to sign the subpoenas, and they're held back on several subpoenas. We have witnesses who refuse to answer questions, and unless we have a subpoena, we're not going to get certain witnesses, and we're not going to get answers from other people. They're setting up interviews for out of Washington, D.C., in New York City, when we're voting. They're rushing interviews without complete information. They're making this as difficult as possible. The problem is, if they continue to do this, only the Speaker of the House, and I put this on Paul Ryan, can change that. And the rogue investigations they're doing now are merely a shiny object they're hoping to deflect attention from the American public.
I want to move on to international issues, but one last thing. You know, some people are getting ready for Mueller to announce, you know, another indictment at some point. It would seem something would come soon. Maybe it's a Jared Kushner. Maybe it's a Don Jr. I don't know. It's got to go up from where he's been going. My question is, if that happens, that seems to be when things hit the fan, right? The president pulls out the pardon power, various things. My question is, your Republican colleagues, do they continue to do what they're doing, which is, we got to get rid of Mueller, this is a witch hunt, he's got to be shut down, or do people wake up and say, I don't know what's going on here, but we need to get to the bottom of it?
Well, let's remember, if this is a witch hunt, Mueller has already bagged 4 witches, 4 close Trump associates. 2 of them are cooperating, Papadopoulos and General Flynn. General Flynn is in the White House. So this is a big deal. So if they're going to do that, I think that, you know, they're already trying to halt the investigation or slow its progress or create diversions or quite simply obstruct justice.
You said on House Intel last night when I talked to you about being on the show, North Korea was my first agenda item for you. The president's tweets, my button is bigger than yours. And of course, when challenged about that, the White House essentially says, look, we're not starting up. Kim Jong-un is starting up. He's a madman. And I'm thinking, if you're dealing with a madman, if that's true, you really want to, no pun intended, push his buttons.
Yeah, it's hard to totally analyze Kim because we're not that close to him. He is an evil person and he's very, very dangerous. we don't know enough about his personality to know how he'll react to these things. So that's what makes it particularly scary and widely inappropriate. We didn't know exactly how Russia would react during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but John F. Kennedy didn't taunt Khrushchev. He didn't say, "I dare you," or "we have more weapons than you do," or "my button's bigger than your button," because he knew that he was messaging to the heart of the American public and to the world and all our allies and to the brain trust in the Kremlin.
You know, some military leaders have said we're closer now to nuclear war than we've ever been, as you know, advisors to Trump. You're a congressman, you're there, you know far more than any of us. Are you nervous about a nuclear war, or is that not a likely thing?
There's a lot of things that make me nervous in this day and age, right? Particularly acts of terrorism on the home front. Those are very real threats, probably our greatest threat we face on a day-to-day basis. There's huge swaths of ungoverned territory in the Middle East that create great opportunities for terrorist acts and radicals to be formed there and create problems here. But it is starting to concern me more and more because of how our president is responding to these threats and the fact that he wants to build up our nuclear arsenal, regardless of the fact that building our arsenal doesn't deter other people.
Iran. You know, the president tweeting about that too, speaking to the people of Iran. We're with you, and the United States is watching. But my sense is that we're not exactly favored people among folks in Iran. So the question is, do you even think they're paying attention to his tweets? And when you have Nikki Haley go before the UN and say, hey, all good countries come together and support it, I'm thinking a lot of countries aren't really in the mood for assisting the United States much either, but maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, they don't know quite how to do this. I mean, the fact is you want to rally around your allies when these threats come out. And if you really want to appeal to the Iranians, this is an extraordinarily well-educated public there. You know, what are they fighting for? They're fighting against the corruption and the state-run economy that's ineptly put together and run. They're fighting for equality issues. So I suspect President Trump is probably the last person they would believe cares about any of those things, particularly when he talks about a Muslim ban.
You're ready to return to Washington. One more thing on the international front. What's number one on your agenda? Is it, we didn't even talk about Israel, the notion of taking the position there about Jerusalem as the capital for the United States or for our embassy, which means I don't know if we can be a neutral player. What's the number one issue when you go back? Is it Israel? Is it North Korea? Is it Iran?
Well, to focus on Israel just for a second, it just goes further proof that working with our allies and not unilaterally is absolutely critical. We still have to fund the government. We still have to move forward on a coherent basis, deciding what our priorities are going to be, infrastructure, all the other issues that were there before, and obviously the dreamers. We haven't taken care of this at all, despite the president's promise and bipartisan promise of support from my Republican friends. So they're still facing the very real prospect of the fact that they have opened up, told us all about themselves, and they might get kicked home.
And that, Congressman, is exactly the agenda for our next segment. So we're going to turn domestic, and we'll be right back with Congressman Mike Quigley.